You had to apply, but in Iowa's case, you had to be feeble-minded in order to get sterilized. And so women would actually go in and say, I'm feeble-minded, and do this, and they would get tested by psychologists and stuff like that, and they'd be found to be either if the welfare workers decided that they were good parents or that they had too high of IQ, they'd be denied sterilization. And so what this demonstrates is that actually there was a negotiation process that happened. Some women were forcibly sterilized against their will and called it involuntary, and had either their parents or other family members to sign for them in order so that they could actually leave the hospital, or that they could not be going into a mental institution. And so a lot of what happens is that there's not a lot of education available, access is limited, and so you get into these very murky, muddy areas that both sides are trying to negotiate. Not necessarily some for benevolent reasons, but definitely you find those, if that helps clarify that a little bit.
Questions that you guys have for Beth?
Yeah.
The lady on the first clip that was raped and then went to the hospital, what happened to the baby?
She has her...
I was going to say the man standing next to her, that's her son.
That was him.
Oh,
He now has
The young
6
man standing
businesses.
Next to her, that's fine, that's her son.
I guess he owns 3 businesses.
Yeah, he's very well, yeah.
And that's what's really...
She's done well for herself.
Yeah. Johanna has another, in her introduction, a really sad case too, where the woman that ends up getting sterilized, her daughter was sterilized, and she ended up becoming an amazing nurse and is really well, and she can't have children. And so there's a lot of, very troubling cases that happen. Anything else? Yes.
You mentioned a couple of the other states that were involved in this. Why have they come forward, and why is Carolina so?
Some have actually come forward. At least there's a public apology. I want to say Virginia is one of them as well. Iowa has not, that I know of. And I've only heard this recently, that they've come up with apologies. North Carolina, I think, is the first one, though, to offer restitution. And that's something too, so a lot of these, like Iowa's program, it dissolved in 1977. It dissolved to the board's own conclusion. They basically said that everyone actually has a right to reproductive rights, so they decided after how many years that should be. But other programs really operated into the 70s, and now that's when she was doing those. And so now cases like this are starting to come to light. And so I think that we probably will see more states, as you saw 30 of them were really involved in this. California was the leader in sterilization, and their program, I think, went up into the 70s as well. And so now you're starting to get a lot more, this is becoming, as you see from Brian Williams, it's becoming much more of a public sort of issue. And I think now you're going to start seeing more states that are at least going to maybe issue apologies. But again, the restitution, how do you repair this? I mean, how do you deal with this? And a lot of this issue too, if they didn't have, if for the other states that ended their programs prior or after World War II, a lot of those individuals are dead or passed away. And so it's a very sort of murky line. Also too, for people to come forward. Because a lot of these, like for me, I actually cannot release any, I can release information, but I have to make sure everyone's anonymous and stuff like that for that reason. So I think in those cases too, it's really difficult for people to come forward. Yeah?
No, you mentioned with a lot of that coming to an end, is there still some cases where they might consider this is still a necessity for someone like in this person's case or this person's case?
So what happened, at least in the 1970s, the United States issued its Family Planning Act, which then guaranteed federal funding, and it's Title X of the Public Health Services Act in the 1970s. And they actually then allotted, I think it was under President Nixon's administration, that they allotted federal funding then and so they kind of took away all the sort of stipulations for sterilization. So now contraceptive use for sterilization, or sterilization for contraceptive use, is actually now federally funded. So they kind of made this a program. So now, and going under the auspice of this is totally a voluntary situation. And that was geared towards individuals on welfare. And so one of the things that happened after this case, or after this act, was that HMOs for women and for families on welfare, HMOs will pay and cover sterilization, or they'll cover part for non-permanent birth control. And that was an issue definitely in the late 1990s, and I believe still today. And so you can guess from the implications of that what that means. And so now you're starting the eugenics board and those things, those passed away in the 70s. And so there's not necessarily, at least all the eugenics societies have ended, and eugenics sort of came under the auspice of genetics, or at least it transferred into, once it sort of lost its scientific legitimacy, then genetics really became sort of what people were sort of going for. So eugenics has sort of lost that, but definitely sterilization is very much
So just
a
took
part.
over to birth control and stuff like that, and maybe you can volunteer yourself, but
Exactly, and that's actually, for at least for reproduction, I think sterilization is the most commonly used form for, I think, worldwide for people. And again, like, now we can see that people would get their tubes tied or vasectomies and stuff like that, and that's become more of a natural process. And so, but what we still need to be aware of is that there are certain instances when voluntary becomes not so voluntary, and that's what we still need to be very much aware of.
So would you say that our fascination with genetics now is an extension of eugenics, or is it a divergence?
No, I would definitely say it's a divergence, and Johanna has a great line in her book where, because there are some scholars that would argue that for, like, basically genetic engineering and creating sort of designer babies, that could be something without any defects, and there's some, definitely some sort of contention among some scholars that would think that this might be sort of not necessarily a resurgence of eugenics, but definitely to be aware of. And one of the things I think with genetic engineering, it might be a luxury for the rich, not necessarily being a hindrance to sort of those that can't do it, but it might be just something of a different scale and different category. But there was an interesting movie, it's called like My Sister's Keeper, also the book too, and some people were saying about having donor babies specifically in order to have that child, the genetically donor child, to then give their organs to something else. There's been some issues with there too about how do we deal with reproduction and how do we deal with that sort of go into that realm. Yeah.
I had two thoughts. First of all, sterilization wasn't ever done on the men.
Yes, it was.
Okay.
In the beginning, that's actually what it was done on. His last name is Sharp, and he came up sort of and started using the vasectomy. But it was originally done mainly on prisoners, and it was done on men. And then it switched over, and now predominantly it's performed. I mean, now, because both men and women can, and it's much more voluntary. But at least in the cases that I, and Johanna too, I think ratio was like 95% women.
Okay, so like after the 20s or so,
It's
predominantly women.
starting to become predominantly women. I had some cases, definitely had some cases of men, but it was definitely predominantly women. And I think that also too is sort of a gender dynamic especially after World War II too, with this sort of hypermasculinity after coming back from the war and new gender roles and stuff like that.
Right.
So.
Then my other question is how, you mentioned how after World War II and sort of the atrocities that happened under Nazi Germany, that it kind of became, people were a little more embarrassed or like they didn't like it as much. So how were the two programs similar? What was going on in Nazi Germany and what was going on in the U.S.? Maybe you don't.
I don't necessarily have the scope for Nazi Germany. I mean, I know a little bit that I think a California doctor was sort of Hitler modeled sort of issues that were going on in California, or just like their procedures and stuff like that and what they were targeting. And I know Hitler sort of modeled it after sort of our eugenics program. But I do not know. Definitely it was a much more vigorous and much more all-encompassing program that really I mean,